side. My name is Meinrad Weiss. I'm working as Cloud Solution Architect for Microsoft. And I will cover mainly the first part where we are talking about the options that we have on premise. And it is clear something will change. And the idea of our presentation is that we try to give you some hints that you can minimize the impact and also optimize the benefit. And maybe there will be some places where at the end of the day you say, okay, it's good that we made some of the changes. We have also profit from the change. The agenda is the first piece of the presentation will be held by myself, and there we are talking about refactoring on premise. And then in the second part, we will also talk about, or Joost will talk about the cloud pathway for SQL Server. We would like to show you the opportunities that are located there. The strategy that I try to explain is to give you some hints how you can use the least expensive license for SQL Server, which is legal. And also to show you some benefits that you can get if you migrate to new releases. And for that, there you have the option to deliver quicker results coming from the SQL Server to the customer, or to optimize the hardware infrastructure and work with less expensive servers to do the same work. And of course, we always consider cloud services, but at the beginning, I believe there are also several options that can be applied on premise. I put on this slide a diagram with relative prices. And if you are licensing a SQL Server, then for sure the Enterprise Edition, which has most of the functionality in it, is the most expensive product. And if we have today some workload on Enterprise Edition that doesn't really require an Enterprise Edition license, then we can reduce the cost down to about 25% by just switching from an Enterprise Edition to a standard edition of SQL Server. And there are two other editions out there. There's a Developer Edition and an Express Edition, and these two editions have no cost at all. And so the more we manage to get the workload from probably the left-hand side, all databases running in an Enterprise Edition to a standard or Developer Express Edition, the lower the issue with the pricing is, and the simpler is to do the migration. I saw some numbers from hospitals which have been able to use the Enterprise Editions for free, and they had in this example here a ratio of 10 times more Enterprise Edition than Standard Edition. And in my regular life, I most of the time see exactly the opposite, that a few databases really require Enterprise Edition, but most of the databases don't need that, can easily work with standard, or even in some cases Developer or Express Edition. On this slide, you can see in text form and read later the different options that we have. There is also a web edition, which is in the pricing a little bit below standard, but I don't want to talk too much about that. If you have really a web application, then probably it makes sense, but in most cases I see either the Enterprise Edition with all capabilities, the standard with some limits, developer targeting a development workload, and on one side really development work, but also test systems, which mean if an application is moving from the development tier to the production via a test infrastructure where you only do test workload and nothing real production work, then it is also legal to work with that Developer Edition. And then on the Express edition, this one is really free. There are some limits regarding the data volume that can be handled. But if there are smaller applications, maybe together with some laboratory devices which don't need really a huge storage space, then it is in some cases feasible even to switch to the Express edition. And on that slide, there again, the 3 editions with a little bit more information regarding the functionality that is included, that you can see that even with an Express edition, it is feasible to have up to 16 cores. And a few, 2 or 3 years ago, a 60-core database server that has been more or less the biggest machines that I usually saw out in the field, which mean even not that tiny databases up to 64 gigabytes can be handled by an Express edition. And then we have the big brother, Standard and Enterprise. And in the past, regarding the functionality of Transact SQL syntax, there has a big difference in between the different product SKUs, but we are trying to move the functionality down also to the smaller tiers. You can see that, for example, encryption was not feasible to do in Express edition in the past, but now it is possible. Or even data classification and auditing in the past, that has been a feature of the Standard edition or even the Enterprise edition, and all of that stuff is moving down over the period of time. And you can also see here at the bottom that the developer edition really covers all the programmatic features of all the other editions, which mean if developers are using the developer edition, if they create an application, if they test it against the developer edition, you can be sure that it will work one-to-one either on the Express, on the Standard, or on the Enterprise edition. This slide is more for recap. If you have some detailed question, how is the biggest database sites that can be covered by one of these editions, you can take a quick look on that slide. I don't believe that I have to read that. I will come back again to the developer edition. The thing I said already earlier, there is no technical difference between Enterprise edition and the developer edition. There are some people outside which try to tell you, well, also the developer needs to have an Enterprise edition to be sure that the application will run. From a technical perspective, that's just not true. You can see it here. It's with an older version, but it's still the same today. We have internally really a release version, 11.0.5.6.3.4.1. And that's the release version for Enterprise Edition, Standard Edition, Developer Edition. And then we have the licensing scheme, how the product is licensed, which of the features are exposed to the outside world, and that is covered by the license. And so you shouldn't be too feared to go for development workload really with that developer edition. Now, if you find out that some of the workload can be moved from an existing Enterprise edition to a lower service tier, then the question will come up is very shortly, how is the best way to do the migration? And there are several ways to do it. The most often used ones is detach attach. The beauty of detach attach is that it is really a very fast operation. If in your architecture all the data files are located on a backend SAN solution, then it's a matter of 2 or 3 seconds, and the database is migrated from an Enterprise edition to a Standard, Developer, or Express edition, whatever you choose. The other option is using backup restore technology. and hopefully you just need the restore piece of it because you are doing regular backups, and you can just pick one of the backups and restore it on the other instance. And I would also especially recommend the restore path for test migrations to be really confident that a migration can be done, that not some of the features which are not supported on the lower tiers are really available on the target platform. We will see it a little bit more in detail. And if you think about migrating databases to Azure, then we have there the database migration service, which handles all the detail of moving databases from on-premise to the cloud. And also there you can achieve more or less no downtime to move a database from on-premise to the cloud. But now let's take a deeper look on detach attach. If you would like to move a database from one server to the other one, you can go in and on the database server where the database is currently located, execute one line of code. This will remove all the logs from the files. And as I said, if the database files are not stored locally on the machine, but on a backend SAN, then you can go directly to step 3 and tell on the new server create database based on the files for attach. And 1 or 2 seconds later, the migration is done. So it's really not a big effort to do that switch from one edition to the other. If you store the data files locally in the machine, then for sure you have to detach. You have then to copy the database files and attach it again. And for the real migration, that's probably the best way that you can do the switch. To prepare the migration, I would recommend that you try to restore a backup file, a regular backup file that you are creating on the target machine where you think the new database should live. Because if the restore operation is not working, if someone has switched on or used the feature which is not supported by the new edition, then you will get back immediately an error message. In my case here, I used column store index and my target database where I try to restore the files does not support this feature. And so I would recommend go in a first step just with a test restore somewhere on a machine, and then you get feedback what is possible to migrate. There is also an analytical way where you can go in and check features, but in my opinion, that's just the simplest way. Then you get also information how long a restore will take if for some reason you would like to go with the restore options. Technical, it doesn't make any difference if you migrate with attach detach or with backup restore. And now I would like to come back to this issue here. I had an old database, Adventure or SQL Server 2014, and here I used an Enterprise edition and I tried to migrate that database to a standard edition, and I got the error message that a standard edition does not support that feature. And at that point, and that's not the end of the life, because as I said earlier, we are trying with new versions to enable features in lower SKUs than in the past. You can see that, for example, in SQL Server 2012, column store index have only been available in Enterprise Edition. With SQL Server 2016, they are also part of the Standard Edition. And so there's always worth to check, well, is this feature available in a newer version of SQL Server? Because at some point in time, you have to do that migration step. And in my case, if I only have these cluster column store indexes in the database, which was hindering the migration, then just with a version upgrade, you can work around that problem and at the end of the day, save 75% of the license costs. There is internally a compatibility level where you can say, even if I did the migration from 2012 to 2016, I would like to have that the behavior of the database is like an older version of the kernel. And that's often a workaround if a supplier, for example, doesn't currently support the newest version of SQL Server. And there is always wise to talk with the software providers if, for example, SQL Server 2016 or 19 is supported with an older switch of the compatibility level. And the compatibility level switch has nothing to do with the licensing.
Meinrad, this is Christoph, just a heads up. There is a question in the chat.
Yes, and the question is, I cannot see it from here.
Okay, so correct that the detach attach is not showing not supported feature. So every DB should be restored first. This is the F4.
Yes, so as I said, there are also SQL scripts out there that you can run on the engine and detect enterprise features. But I personally, if I would have to do that job, I would just generate a restore script on a test infrastructure where I would execute a restore statement just for testing purpose. And if the restore is working, then I'm sure that also for the real migration, detach attach is working. For the databases where I get the error message, I get a clear information, what is the issue, and then I would go and check in the version compatibility, at which version that feature is supported, and clarify with internal the application developer or the software vendor if it is supported to migrate to the newer release. There is an error coming back from attach detach, but it's not that clear. And if you detach a database, you lose connectivity to the database, which means the user cannot work in that time window. And if you are just doing a restore, you can do that restore on an independent server. You can use a backup file that you do with your regular work. So nobody will be affected by this test, and you get really a clear feedback what would go on if you are doing the migration. And it is also valid to do the migration with a backup restore. So it's really no difference at all at the end of the day. And as I said, for example, cluster column store index is one of the newer features. And if you migrate to a newer version of SQL Server, then you can also profit from these features. And I have an example here where we applied a clustered column store index on existing databases. And you can see here we executed then some queries, 5 of them, with SQL Server called, started, and executed the statement or warm, and then calculated what happens if we apply a column store index, and what happens on the cold side and on the warm side with absolute times in second and relative times. And you can see just by applying create cluster column store index on some of the central tables, we went down from 263 seconds to 4.1 seconds, or 24 seconds down to 1 second. On the same hardware without adding anything else. And so I think with migrating, probably you are forced to migrate to be able to run a workload on a lower SKU. You get also benefits from our optimizer, from the technology that is built into the kernel, and you can suddenly either get better response time, that the people are not waiting 4 or more minutes, but 4 seconds, or you can run on the same hardware with less core license, with less infrastructure cost, the same workload. So my conclusion is try to use less expensive SKUs. Try to migrate all the developer databases to developer edition databases. There's really no reason to pay anything for this kind of workload. Consider Express Edition. Express Edition sounds like a toy, but it's, in my opinion, not a toy. And with these two SKUs, you still pay nothing for SQL Server. And then on the other workload areas, try to migrate to the standard edition, probably by lifting the SQL Server version. And if you have to do the lift, or if you already done the lift, really try to use the new database feature and get out most of the platform. That's my part of the presentation. I'm not sure if we would like to do now some Q&A or if we would like to postpone it to the end.
I think if there are questions, then we can quickly do them now. Any questions from the audience? Laurent, do you feel your question has been answered? Okay, good. Then I'll share my screen. And thank you very much, Meinrad, for explaining what benefits could be gained from refactoring your current on-premises estate from enterprise licenses to standard and express licenses. I will use the remaining time to explain some benefits from migrating part of your estate to the cloud. If we look at the modern data estate, or the data estate as we see it at large customers around the world, be it commercial or public, we see a whole range of different services that services and infrastructure that are deployed both on premises and in the cloud. So we have covered it 1.5 weeks ago already in my previous talk about Microsoft Azure, but there are many modern services that are very difficult to deploy on premises. And we see that the world is changing from on-prem only to true hybrid, where data spans your own data centers and public cloud data centers, be it our data centers or other third parties. So we see that the end state of a modern data infrastructure has data stored on premises and in the cloud, where analytics and the actual insight from the data is mostly done in the cloud. Because it's one thing to have data, it's a whole other thing or topic to actually gain insights from that data. So I'll give you a quick glance of what you could benefit from migrating part of your estate, or let's say some relevant data to cloud services. If we think about what those services are, specifically here on the left side, we see more like classic storage and databasing options like SQL database. We have a non-relational or NoSQL data storage product called Cosmos DB, which is one data store which you can access with multiple different APIs, ranging from SQL to MongoDB to Postgres. And then we have like Microsoft develops various open source database products as well. So we see those on the left side, and then on the right side, like how do you then utilize the data? We have various products that can give you insights in what data you actually have, and what insights you can actually get from that data. And in the middle, like the link between the actual analytics and the storage is data warehouse, where data is basically stored in a sort of way that makes it easy for analytics services to get access to it. So migrating is possible in various different scenarios. So we can either think of a migration from on-premises to Azure, or from a third-party cloud to Azure, but also from Azure back to on-prem, or from Azure to another cloud provider. It's all about using the right tool for the right job. So if you gain some insight from an analysis that you did in Azure, it might very well be a reasonable use case to store that insight or that data back to an on-premises server, where you can do further analysis on it, or store it for a longer period of time. It's all about that hybrid picture where data moves across different estates, and of course that has to happen securely. So the security features that are available to you to protect your data, be it in SQL or in MongoDB or in Google Cloud or on-prem, the security features span those three, let's say, storage locations. So we have like a single pane of glass where we can give you insights in the security posture of your data, regardless of where they are stored and in exactly what format they are stored. So again, I want to really stress the hybrid picture of this new world. So that doesn't mean that that, let's say, the boring stuff doesn't count anymore. We also want to make sure that the basis is covered. I think maybe most relevant in the current, let's say, conversation is the total cost of ownership. So if we look at Azure SQL database, which is a platform as a services product, where the server infrastructure is actually abstracted away. So you're really looking at a platform product where we only expose you to the database itself, and you don't have to worry about the operating system. That's where cost savings can really become very significant, because we, as like being Microsoft, storing hundreds of thousands or millions of SQL databases, really have that economies of scale to offer single SQL databases in a very economic way. So it's a platform as a service model, which means that we don't expose the whole operating system to you, but we still make sure that it is as compatible as possible with the classic SQL Server. So we store up to 100 terabytes in a single database on Azure SQL database. So that means that it is a very viable product for even the biggest of workloads. I already mentioned security, again, offering that single pane of glass, regardless of whether your data is stored in an Azure SQL database or in an on-prem SQL server, or in a SQL server running in the Amazon cloud. That doesn't matter. And then lastly, this is also, I think, where it gets interesting. Part of the analytics tools that we offer you are actually built into the product already. So the analysis is done where your data is stored, and that offers additional significant, well, first of all, cost savings, but also efficiency gains. Good. So Azure SQL database, I'm sure, offers the most seamless and economic way to the cloud and to to really unleash or unlock insights out of your data, but it's certainly not the only one. And apologies for maybe rushing through the deck a little bit. You will, of course, receive the slides, but there's a lot of material that I'd like to cover, and I don't have the entire afternoon, unfortunately. So Azure SQL Database Platform as a Service, it's the most, let's say, seamless cloud service and the most low maintenance. So certainly offering you the most benefits, but that doesn't mean that it's the only SQL storage solution that we have on offer. So if we look at the entire cloud portfolio, we of course can also imagine that for traditional lift and shift workloads, where you're running an application on premises and the hardware goes out of service, and you're looking for options to rehost the application, there a traditional infrastructure as a services model is of course very tempting, because the migration can literally be done in, well, let's say pessimistically, a few hours. So of course you can still run your SQL Server on Azure, and that's where we have a concept called hybrid benefit, where you can utilize your on-prem licenses that you've already purchased on these Azure VMs. As you're not paying for the hardware, or you're only paid or billed by the minute for the hardware, that can add to significant cost savings as well, especially if you consider that developer machines don't have to run 24/7, but can be turned on in the evening and at night. So you're only paying for the hardware that you actually use, instead of having all these boxes in the basement. So, and then an option that's sort of in the middle between an infrastructure as a service VM and a fully platform as a service SQL DB is a concept called SQL Managed Instance. And that's so it's still a platform as a services model, so you don't have to care about the operating system itself, but so we still expose you to all the features that you might have, or like, let's say the full flexibility of having control over the operating system. So you can run multiple databases on a managed instance, for example, whereas Azure SQL database is built on a per database model. And we care about, or like, we make sure that the elasticity is covered. On a managed instance, you have to do that yourself, basically. But Azure SQL Managed Instance offers a little, let's say, broader coverage for even the most legacy applications that you might still have running on premises. But we care about updating and patching the operating system. So that's the range of SQL products that we have on offer in Azure. This is a quick recap of the billing models that you have available in these platform as a services models. So left, I already mentioned the single database instances, and on the right hand side you have the managed instance, and then in the middle you have something called an elastic pool, where you can deploy, let's say, unpredictable workloads, and it scales out as far as needed to cover the current API calls or the current load, basically. The single DB instance or license or billing model is meant for predictable workloads, because it doesn't scale out without your, let's say, knowing. So SQL database managed instances, again, so you get full SQL Server service area, which means that you have the full flexibility of the SQL operating system. It's always up to date because we care about the patching. And we have a 99.99 SLA out of the box, which is, I think, very good. I don't know what's your current uptime in your data center, but we see most customers aren't able to manage the 99.99% uptime. Yeah, exactly. So again, repeating myself, SQL database is most certainly the most cost-effective path to the cloud. So we see cost savings on the order of 80%. And then I'm not comparing it to the enterprise license, then I'm comparing it to the standard license. So I'm not cheating here. It is a very, very significant cost saving. And that's all due to economies of scale. And so where do these cost savings then come from? The hybrid benefit I already mentioned, where you can utilize the on-premises licenses that you have already paid for. Second, reserved capacity. So if you say, well, I have a very predictive workload that's certainly going to run for another couple of years, or a year or 2 years or 3 years, you can say, okay, I will pay for the compute power up front, and that will give me another 30 to 50% in cost savings. And that's purely for the infrastructure. So that's even making the infrastructure itself cheaper. So there is absolutely no way that if you utilize reserved instances that you can compete with that on a price level on premises. There is absolutely no way. Just because it's so much cheaper. And then lastly, Mine had also mentioned it, but we for development and testing, we don't charge for licensing fees. And if you use the platform as a services model, you can also save additionally on the compute and infrastructure power, because we co-locate different databases closer together on a single, let's say, physical machine, completely transparent to you, of course. So this is a study. I'm not going to discuss it in depth, but Forrester conducted a study on the total economic impact of Azure SQL database, and found that the return on investment is, I will not quote the exact 212% because it highly depends, but then they took an average of 5 different customers, all in the mid-size range, and who all did a data modernization project, and they looked at aspects such as, obviously the avoided infrastructure cost that you would incur on premises, but also increased database administrator productivity because they don't have to patch an operating system anymore. I mean, that's a significant, let's say, time eater that you don't have anymore. And in the time that these administrators would normally patch their operating systems, they can be assigned to more valuable tasks that directly add value to your business. So you have a general improved IT staff productivity, because people can be assigned to more, let's say, or to less pointless tasks, such as upgrading operating systems. And then, of course, like our SLAs are very, very, let's say, competitive. There are very few customers who can hold up their databases for, let's say, or who can avoid less downtime than the 99.99% SLA. So that also increases the productivity. So that all counts towards the the improvement in total cost of ownership. So the entire study, it's about 20 pages. If you want to have the detail, then I can recommend you to read it. So it's an independent study, but it was commissioned by us, of course, but we don't have any editorial power over the conclusions that they draw. So protect. So I already mentioned security, so I will rush through this as well. But a few years ago, we introduced let's say, feature called SQL Advanced Threat Protection. Originally, it was meant for Azure SQL DB, so the platform as a services model. But we've been working very hard to extend it to first to normal infrastructure as a services virtual machines, and then to on-premises and to other clouds. So now we can truly say we have a single pane of glass when it comes to database security over a hybrid estate, and I think that's extremely valuable. So I'm very happy to do a deep dive on database security. Another interesting feature of SQL database is that so it has a machine learning engine built in that helps you optimize your performance and queries. So that's another feature that you can get benefit out of. So this is basically the modern data estate, covering both your own data center and the cloud. And so now we come to my last topic, which is the analysis of your data. So where do I do this analysis, and how do I do it? I mean, we live in a world of big data, and companies are, let's say, inventing new data analysis solution every day. So the modern, let's say, analytics architecture gets complex very quickly, and you really have to keep an eye on all the different components. But the components are, of course, there to offer you flexibility. So flexibility where your data is stored, flexibility which program languages you use, flexibility on what visualization tool you use, or flexibility on what database model you use. So like a typical architecture goes something like, can you see my mouse? Yeah. On the left hand side, we store data in whatever database model and in whatever format, be it blobs or files or IO data. Then we have to ingest it into some kind of service. So an example here is Azure Data Factory to basically prepare it to be analyzed. Obviously there it gets stored, and then we can, let's say, use various products, be they open source or products offered by software vendors, where we can build machine learning models on the data to get insights out of the data. Then we can deploy the actual insights to our applications, to our business applications, where these insights and the data is used and incorporated in a feedback loop to get more data. And then lastly, or the last component would be the visualization of the insights or of the data. Again, like it's one thing to store data, it's a whole different ball game to actually use the data that I have available. And I think unlocking my data stores to start utilizing it is the big challenge in the 21st century, or let's say in the modern data or big data world. So I want to have one more, let's say, side note about privacy. There's one thing I can say very clearly. If you use our services, you have control over the collection, use, and distribution of data. We do not look at our customers' data. We don't monetize it. We don't reuse it. We don't use it to sell you or your customers advertisements. And then, of course, we're very transparent about data location. So we have 2 data centers in Switzerland. If you create an Azure SQL DB in Switzerland, the data stays there guaranteed. Don't trust our word for it. Read the audit reports by KPMG and the like, who audit us on a continuous basis. So lastly, in the last 3 minutes, and then we have 10 more minutes to open up the mic for questions. How to do this, right? Like how to get started with such a migration project. And I've already mentioned it during my last call 1.5 weeks ago. First, like, so let's say the goal is to migrate a certain percentage of your databases from on-premises to Azure, so that you can utilize the most modern analysis services to gain insights from your data. First, you have to know what you're talking about. Like, what do you have on premises? What version are you utilizing? What data is it? Where is it stored? What kind of service are you using? How much of the database is actually under strain? Like how much is a database currently utilized? So only if you have those questions answered in the assess phase, let's say, you can think about migrating it. And I would say, like, migrating, if you have asked yourself the right questions, and we can help with that, is the first step. And after that, like after you're up and running in Azure, you can optimize. And we see that after a large migration project, the costs you incur within Azure can usually be reduced by another 10 or 20% because of, let's say, recommendations that we can only sort of get once you are up and running in Azure. So this optimization phase is, well, that's let's say a new concept that you have in cloud computing, but since there are features being released, let's say almost every day, it is very important that you are optimizing your estate or your architecture or your infrastructure on a continuous basis, just to make sure that you're always using the newest features and that you're not paying too much. So usually after a migration, let's say your monthly costs are 10,000 francs per month, like no questions asked basically, and then you start optimizing your estate, and then you can usually save another 10 to 20% just because of the experience that you gained basically. So of course there are many things that you can do yourself. We have a total cost of ownership calculator that can provide you with detailed financial modeling of what a migration would cost you. Then we have the Azure Data Migration Center with tons and tons of documentation and tools to actually run these assessments on premises. And then, well, Azure Essentials is a series of trainings to get you fully acquainted with cloud concepts. And then, of course, we also offer assistance in the form of Fast Track. So Azure Fast Track is a free service that you can use to migrate part of your data. So these are actual like engineers that help you migrate part of your data from on-prem to Azure and really get up and running with that hybrid infrastructure. We also work closely together with partners and with other system integrators. So if you need help, then feel absolutely free to reach out. So that was it from my side. I think I'm exactly 10 to 3. We have 10 more minutes for questions. Very happy to answer, and also very happy to dive into a follow-up session. I realize I treated a lot of information in a very fast pace. So if there is interest in individual deep dives, then we're very happy to organize these. Any questions? There's nothing in the chat. Comments, that's also fine. If there aren't any questions, then I'm going to stop the recording. I'm going to stay into the call in the call for another couple of minutes, just if someone thinks of something. But I'm going to stop the recording.